We're the Fly Over Yogis, a group of Midwest friends sharing practical, everyday approaches to yoga, wellness, lifestyle,
and everything in between as we live through them ourselves, yoga on and off the mat.
We are Lindsay, Gina,
Jordan,
and Megan. We work to create authenticity in everything we do.
And we're sharing our experiences with others to inspire mindful living, no matter your home state.
Today we are going to talk about challenges. Challenges we face in our daily lives, in yoga classes, how to begin to view these challenges as positive instead of negative, and how we can start to intentionally challenge our minds and bodies to improve our life. The connotation of the word challenge denotes negativity for most people. We perceive it as something difficult or hard, something that pushes us mentally or physically, that often causes stress on the mind or body. But yoga is about exploring the limits of the body in a positive way in order to grow as a person, which is a challenge. We just don't tend to think of it in a positive way 100% of the time. So yoga challenges, guys, how do we feel about those? Are we, as teachers, as yogis, where do you find them showing up the most in your practice?
I think that there's a good mix between what I find challenging as a yoga teacher or instructor and what I find challenging in my own yoga practice. And when I have to step into the role of student, that's been a big challenge for me recently because I'm always planning a class or thinking of a class or, working on a transition in my teaching, my cues. And sometimes I have a hard time as a yoga teacher when I go to another class to not be like, oh, I really liked that transition. Oh, I really enjoyed how she cued that. And to step out of the role of teacher and into the role of student. Not all the time, but there are times where I really struggle with that. And I have like this internal war in my mind, like, stop noting everything she's saying. And I have to literally tell myself, be a student. And of course, if you're a student, you don't have this specific problem, but I'm finding that as an instructor, there are times, especially as recently, where I've had a hard time stepping into that role of student. So what are your guys' thoughts on that?
I'm glad that you really brought that up because I was talking to Kelsey, who's a local studio owner, and Megan actually works at her studio. I was talking to her this morning and talking to her about how difficult it is for me to even get to a yoga class these days because I'm always teaching when times of other yoga classes are. So it's like I literally can't go. And, there's the option of a home practice, of course. And then there's the option of when I'm not teaching, do I have the energy to go to a class? And so, I think that is a huge challenge that we don't necessarily talk about or think about before we start teaching is how am I going to continue my own journey as a practitioner of yoga, and what happens if that starts to suffer, because I don't think that we could really authentically call ourselves teachers if we let that go, if we stopped the journey, stopped the self-discovery of yoga, and while trying to encourage our students to never stop, to never stop the journey or whatever. So I agree. I think that that's something I'm facing right now.
Well, and I think it's important, too, to, not try to separate those two things. Because initially, when I first started teaching, I tried to separate. It's like, okay, today I'm a yoga teacher, and today I'm a yoga student. And I found that it was really hard for me to even just connect with my body at all, or my mind, or just get into that right headspace at all. Because I was so focused on, what hat am I wearing? Whereas, being able to focus more on, connecting the two and having them be, this is my life as a yogi. And just viewing it that way versus one or the other, I think has been a big one for me.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like sometimes I haven't struggled with this portion yet, but I know other yoga instructors who've been teaching much longer than we have that I've talked to said one of the things they struggle with is sometimes teaching 10, 15, 20 classes a week, which is an immense amount of classes for one yoga instructor to instruct during a week's span, is that sometimes ego takes over a little bit and they start teaching their practice to the students instead of teaching maybe what the students need. And I haven't quite ran into that yet to where I'm just, I'm going to teach whatever feels good in my body today to the class instead of seeing what the class needs. But there's definitely some classes that I've taken from some instructors where I feel, is this a class for me or is this a class for them? And then there's the other point of, why do I have that mindset? Is the teacher teaching because of their ego, or are they teaching just an authentic practice? And I think sometimes there's just that authenticity from an instructor there, and there's other times where I've had an instructor where I just simply didn't like the cues, or maybe I didn't like the transitions, and the class didn't just jive with me all that well. And so I think there's some challenges that I didn't anticipate coming in or coming out of yoga teacher training that I anticipated coming into yoga teacher training. I didn't expect to have some of these challenges as a yoga instructor until I actually got out and started teaching. And sometimes I'll have students ask, what do you do in your home practice? What does your home practice look like? And I struggle answering that question because I don't practice regularly. I would say I have a routine where I get up every morning and I do practice a little bit, but sometimes that's 5 minutes, sometimes that's 20 minutes. Sometimes I don't get to practice until right before I go to bed, and it's like whatever feels good in my body. It's never a set thing. And so I have a hard time answering that question as an instructor to students.
So for me, it's actually kind of the flip side of that, because for our listeners, we all graduated from yoga teacher training in October, and so Gina started teaching before we had even graduated, and then Lindsay started soon after, and then Megan, and I only started teaching, I'm using air quotes right now, earlier this month, because for me, I guess, and there might be a lot of interpretations, a lot of opinions on this, but just the definition of a yoga teacher, if you're not physically standing in front of a class teaching, is that the only way you're a teacher? I don't know if I have an answer to that. I'm sure a lot of people would be like, yes, obviously. But I do know that I have inspired a lot of people to start their own practice even before I was ever teaching, because of, and we talked about this in another episode, but like my social media presence. I am not a super advanced yogi. Again, we talked about the use of that word in the other episode too, based on the advancement of the poses, but just the fact that I've led people to the practice of yoga, both the poses and then the lifestyle and the mindset. And so that for me was a challenge also, and be like, especially when I start moving around with my husband a lot and we're going to be moving somewhere every few months, I know I won't be able to physically stand in front of a class and teach, at least not very often. I can host stuff at the park every once in a while, but again, I won't have, since it's a business, a customer base build up in all these different places. So that's a challenge for me too. It's like, well, do I have to stop calling myself a teacher because I don't have a set schedule at a set studio every week? So
I think that brings up a really good point, actually, of what makes a yoga teacher. Is it the advanced postures? Is it having a student base? Is it, because I think from your perspective, I've always looked at you as a yoga teacher, even during yoga teacher training. You're welcome, boo. Because, I've always seen you do have a very large social media following. From my perspective, I've always been like, damn, Jordan. And you do post a lot about your journey, and there are poses that I've seen you do, like your walkover is gorgeous, and I aspire to get there because my walkover is real interesting right now. And that's a challenge.
Progress.
Yeah, it's progress, and that's a challenge that I face right now. And I think that as teachers, and maybe Lindsay as, a high school teacher, as something that's not even a yoga teacher, can also comment on this a little bit, is when I always thought of teachers like from high school or middle school or college, I always thought of the teachers that inspired me, that cultivated something in me, that did something, that brought some sort of feeling up. And I think that in yoga, there is a lot of emotion that's in the practice that we attach to the practice. And I think that having those attachments and being inspired does make you a teacher. And so I think even though you haven't been teaching, since we first graduated, I think you've still been a teacher since we've graduated because you have inspired others around you.
I for sure agree with that. Yeah, when you said that, Jordan, I was like, oh no, you're still, that is a teacher. Like, you're teaching, you're sharing, and you're right. I thought, how do I have that in my full-time job as a high school teacher? And now that I think about it, there are lots of students I interact with who are not in my class, and so, but they would still call me a teacher. So I think, yeah, to understand that from an instructor position or perspective as a yoga instructor, I think that same concept applies for sure. But I would say that is a challenge to kind of think, and that would be a mental challenge that you face, is like, do I get to call myself this, or what does it really mean to be that? Because it's something that we wonder, and we wonder if other people will think of us in a different way, but I think that there are lots of yoga teachers who solely do an online platform. You know, I think of, shout out to Yoga with Adrienne. I know she teaches more than just through her online studio. She has free videos on YouTube. She's got a subscription that you can also pay for, but also she teaches classes traveling around the country. But I think she started out, and if you're listening, Adrienne, which would be awesome, correct us. We love
Come
you.
be a guest on our podcast.
Yeah. She does a ton of online stuff, and she is for sure 100% a teacher. So yeah, no, I don't think you should have any fear.
Okay, really, this is not completely related,
That's okay.
but as a teacher, it's not even necessarily related to challengers, or I guess it could be. What have been some parallels that you have found from teaching in a school as a high school teacher to being a yoga teacher?
So I definitely can see the use of routine. We talked about in one of our other episodes, how is it that ritual or routine benefits us, and I talked a little bit about how if I deviate from a certain routine that my students feel it. They may not notice that that's why, but I do, because they're driving me crazy. I love you guys if you're listening. But also the understanding that every person learns differently, and that includes from teaching a high school English and literature course versus in a yoga class. Even though the content is very different, the approach really is pretty similar. I go in with the understanding that I have different bodies and minds with different needs depending on the day, depending on the circumstance in their life at that time. And I may not always know that about a person, but if I have enough contact with them, for example, a frequent returner to a yoga class versus a student who sits in my class every day, even though I may not have contact with them or I may not have an in-depth conversation about what's going on in their life, by looking at them, their body language, I can usually tell, like, if there's something different that's going on, if they maybe have something that's going on. They don't have to tell me about that, but I would approach my teaching a little bit differently. But that is kind of a creative challenge, definitely, that I face, because as a yoga teacher, sometimes we do hands-on adjustments, and so you would want to approach that differently. I do not do hands-on adjustments in my English class, just for clarification. There's no use for that.
I was wondering where this parallel was going.
No, if I notice something that is different, that might possibly be a situation that is going on in the life of one of my yoga students, if they maybe just seem a little distant, if I can see a look on their face or a look in their eyes that shows me that something might be going on, I'm not going to ask them about it, just like I wouldn't always ask a student. A lot of times they will volunteer it, and depending on how close I am with them, whatever. But I would approach maybe my suggestions differently in the class that I'm teaching. I would approach maybe giving an adjustment a little bit differently, just like I would maybe if a student in my English class is having a hard time and I can tell, I might give them the allowance to maybe not work in groups that day if they just need some time on their own, or if they seem a little distracted, I'm not going to necessarily call them out in the middle of class and say you need to be working or get on task. I would approach it in a different way and go over to them and talk. So, I mean, there is a lot of crossover just because of the philosophy behind being a teacher, regardless of whatever medium you're using, whatever content you're teaching, you would approach that philosophy in the same way. So, yeah, those are just a couple of examples. But for sure, there is a lot of crossover.
So switching gears just a tiny bit, unless someone else had another comment, as a teacher, but what about just for yoga in general? Like just a general, like within your practice, or just within like yoga that you see on Instagram, or just like the yoga that surrounds you or at studios, just anything in general. Like what kind of challenges do you face personally?
So one of the things that Lindsay and I talked about during a training that we did up in Kansas City for restorative yoga is it was a very different change of pace than what we're used to here. And we were both shown a different side of yoga that we'd never really viewed before, and it was a different type of yoga, and there's just a bunch of different modalities, and just the studio atmosphere was different, and that kind of made me question what, not only as a teacher, but as a student, what type of atmosphere do I really want to practice yoga in? And that's something that I am struggling a little bit in my practice. Do I want to have a heavy meditation practice? Do I not? Do I want to have a very heavy asana practice or posture practice where I'm just practicing pose after pose after pose, and I'm trying to cram in as many poses and as many transitions as possible? And I think that's not...
More of a workout.
Yeah, more of a workout. I don't think that's necessarily like a monthly struggle. I think that's a daily struggle for me, of waking up and actually trying to respect my body and say, okay, what do I actually need today? Because in my mind, I could say, today we're doing 50 chaturangas, I'm doing a half mala,
Woof.
you know, we're going crazy. You know,
The rest of us are looking at each other like, what?
But I think we have these sometimes expectations of our yoga practice, and our bodies tell us different. And that is a challenge for us to actually respect what our bodies want in the practice.
So kind of piggybacking off of that, actually, how we talked about earlier, or maybe it was a different episode, but about comparison. Because I know we all talk about, like, oh, not to compare yourself to the others on social media and all that stuff.
Guilty.
Right? It's like, I still do it. And that is definitely a challenge. I will say that because of my practice and the community of people that I have around me in my yoga community have made me more aware of this.
Oh, absolutely.
So that I'm able to reflect on it, be more self-aware, and come to that point where I'm like, okay, I'm comparing myself. That is not the point of this. I have my own practice. Because I say to people all the time, if they say, oh, I could never do that because I post some picture on Instagram or whatever, and I always tell them, like, oh, 3 years ago I would have said the exact same thing, because I literally did. I remember my very first quote-unquote real, I highly, very strongly use quotation marks around the word real, but like a flow of yoga, and I saw all these crazy poses happening. I'm like, I could never do any of that. And now I can actually do a lot of them, which is amazing. Not that that's the point of this conversation, but just saying, who people always say that to me, like, oh, I can never do that. I'm like, oh, I used to say the same thing. Don't compare yourself, blah, blah, blah. And I still do it all the time.
It's a human emotion. It's a very human thing to do.
And especially with just the consumption of media that we have available to us, and especially our generation, we're all in our mid-20s, and our generation has grown up with media and
Or late 20s.
That's okay. I now am past the 25 mark as well. So I think that the consumption of, or the availability of media, whether that is when we were growing up, teenagers, probably more magazines and commercials, and now social media, it creates a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, because you do compare just because it's there. And so I love, as a side note, I love that there are so many different bodies and just, types of people being represented, because holy cow, it makes a difference in how people view themselves. But that's probably a whole other episode.
Yeah.
I would like to say, though, lately, and wow, this is so relevant, and I wanted to just put up my emoji praise hands here. I'm so sorry. I wanted to just, the yes sort of thing. Because in my practice lately, I've hit this place where I am sick of, within my own practice, being like, I have to do this today, or I have to be at this point because I have been doing yoga for X amount of years, or I've been teaching yoga for X amount of months, and I should be able to do this. Or I see someone who has been practicing yoga for less time than I have, who's able to do things, and I'm like, why can I not? And I was listening to an episode from the Bad Yogi podcast. Hope she's listening too. Hey. And she talked about how one weekend she was like, I'm going to get my handstand this weekend. And she said she threw herself up in the air in handstand 200 plus times in a weekend. And she was like, I'm going to get it. And she talks about this twinge in her shoulder that she started to feel, and she kind of ignored it and pushed past it. And now, as a teacher, she says, I can teach handstand in my practice. However, I have now eliminated the possibility of that posture from my own practice because I pushed past where my body was ready to go and I ignored it. And so for me lately, I have been trying to see where is that line for me. So lately I have been really frustrated with my king pigeon, and I'm trying to like flip my grip and grab my foot from behind. And there was a day where I was in my living room and I had props and I was looking in the mirror and I was like, gosh, I'm not even close. And I was so frustrated because I thought I've been working on this for so long, and I mean my body should be open, but there was a little pinch in my shoulder, and I was reminded of what Bad Yogi was talking about. Erin, I believe her name is Erin, I think. If that's wrong, I'm sorry. And she was talking about ignoring that, and I thought, okay, so this is me and my body telling me I need to not ignore that twinge in my shoulder because I don't want to eliminate anything from my own practice, but I need to eliminate the ego out of my practice because maybe my body is never going to be meant to do king pigeon without the prop of a strap, and that should be okay. And so I'm kind of working through that myself. That is a big challenge with postures right now, is that I'm trying to allow my body and myself some grace for being what it is and who it is and not comparing it to others. And that is a huge challenge, I know, for lots and lots of people. And even when I attend classes, and you guys probably can too, but you can usually tell who the person is who's maybe showing off a little bit, or it seems maybe like, and maybe it's just our perception of that, where you're like, well, they're doing everything or they're doing extra, so maybe they're showing off, and that could totally just not be even true at all, but maybe that's my perception of it. And we try to keep up, and that's not right either. And so that's something that just for me, I'm trying to just slow things down and really super listen to my body and what it needs and where it maybe shouldn't be going. And it might be a particular day, and it may be for life. But I was really inspired by Erin from Bad Yogi's story about that, because I think that something clicked with me for that. Something made me understand how I should be as a teacher and as a yoga practitioner, and that it's not of a yogic mindset to push your body past what it needs or wants. Like, that's not what yoga is meant to do. So yeah, that's my challenge right now, is with the actual postures, the actual asana in the practice, is to be where I'm at, to meet myself where I'm at, and to be okay with it. And I'm hoping that starts to resonate with my students as well.
For sure.
I had I'd actually just been thinking of the challenge of someone being in the class doing extra as a challenge, because that's me sometimes. It definitely depends on the studio, the class. There's so many different variables, but sometimes I'm the person doing the least, and some, like, you know, quote unquote, I'm the person doing the less advanced postures, and sometimes I'm the person doing the most advanced postures. So, like you said, it is definitely an interpretation of it. So,
yeah, for sure.
It can definitely seem to new people, like that person showing off. Because I would definitely sometimes, because of my own frustrations of being new to yoga, I would be frustrated, like, oh, that person's just showing off. Except now I know that I can honestly say I am not trying to show off. If people interpret it differently, like, that's, you know, there's their own perspective. But I know that there are certain poses that don't challenge me enough in my own practice, so I do add on something a little bit more challenging or more advanced, because I know that in order for me to progress in my own practice, I have to do those things. And it's totally okay and actually awesome that people aren't there yet, because they're in their own practice. They started at a different time. And yes, it is really frustrating when someone who started like last week is able to do, you know, handstand like it's nothing, you know? But all our bodies are different. So, like, even the timeline doesn't necessarily matter. It's, our own bodies, our own practice, our own journey. And
I'm glad you said that, because as soon as I said that, I was like, I meant to say, yeah, I perceive it as like showing off, and
Right.
that has such a negative connotation. But you're totally right. It's more about where that person who's interpreting it is coming from,
Right.
in their own perception of themselves. Because yes, you're so right. Like when I'm probably wishing that I could do that I had the energy, or that I'm just like, well, I'm not doing all of that. And it's more from me, and I don't want to be there. Definitely. It's not about them, because I have no idea what's going on in that person's mind or body. I have no clue. And so I definitely think that it is for sure coming more so from my perspective as the viewer of other people in the class. And so that's another challenge, is just like, I'm also a swim coach, and what I tell my students, my swimmers, all the time is swim your own water, swim your own lane, because they're like, I'm trying to keep up with the girl next to me, because usually, if you know anything about swimming, like people swim next to the people that they are have the closest times to. And I tell my students that all the time. I'm like, stop worrying about other people and just swim your water, and whatever you do is your best, like, and and I'm okay with that, as long as you literally have done your best. And so I think I need to take that and apply it to myself.
Isn't it weird how that happens?
humble. Yeah, I think I need to how can I put this in yoga terms? I need to practice my own mat.
Yeah. No, I think that's totally a thing. And kind of coming back to where you're talking about humbling your practice, yoga deals a lot with our bodies, which deals a lot with our health. I mean, our bodies are what keep us here. It's what wakes us up every day. Our bodies are these miraculous things. And sometimes our bodies, I don't want to use the word fail, but they do fail us in a sense. And for me, I struggle a lot with body image in yoga, because I am 5'2", I'm 130 pounds. But like I was discussing with my mother-in-law the other day, I threw out my scale about 6 months ago. I don't own a scale at this point, because I have endometriosis, which causes extra bloating and a handful of things that I'm not going to go into, because that's a whole other subject. But I was telling her I could get on the scale on a Monday and weigh 117 pounds, and I could get on the scale on Friday, living my regular life, my regular diet, and I would weigh 136. And we kind of joked about it of, I bloat like a balloon, but I really do. And it's difficult for me sometimes to go into a yoga studio and to see my reflection in the mirror. And I have that thought, damn, my hips are really big today. Damn, I'm so bloated today. I need to do this pose, or I need to do that pose, or I can't believe this is going on. But that's never going to not be a thing for me. There's not a cure for endometriosis. That's never going to be a problem I don't face. And it's something that I've had to deal with both emotionally, physically, and mentally. And I think that's a challenge in yoga is, yes, we do have the asanas. Yes, we do have the postures. But yoga can go so far beyond the postures, and it can go into that emotional, mental state. And it is something where I have accepted a lot of what my body is. And I have accepted that there are days where I have six-pack abs and I'm pumped. Those days, because I probably post a picture on Instagram, because I am so excited to share that with people, that you can have that. It's just work and whatever. But then there are also days where I wake up in the morning and I look 6 months pregnant and I throw on the biggest sweater to hide it. And that's something that I fight with just in my own practice and in my life, because a lot of yoga, I say it a lot, and this is kind of our motto as the Fly Over Yogis, is yoga on and off the mat. And I do struggle with yoga off the mat sometimes, in that body positive image and loving my body, whether I'm 117 pounds or 136 pounds, because my body is trying to attack itself, and so that does change my practice a little bit, and taking the time to respect where my body's at, like we've kind of talked about through this whole episode, it's a huge mindset shift of respecting what you need. Sure, I can do king pigeon. Sure, I can do forearm stand sometimes. But there are days where, I don't even try. I don't even try to go into king pigeon. I don't do my Urdhva Dhanurasana, which a lot of us consider wheel, where just your hands and your feet are on the mat. There are days where I don't do inversions, not because I feel that my upper body is weak, but because I would rather focus on my hips, and I focus a lot on twists. And that's another thing that I struggle with and is a challenge for me, is respecting where my body's at, because it changes so quickly and so rapidly. And I mean, whether you have endometriosis or not, shout out 1 in 10 women do, but whether you have it or not, there there is something that all of us are facing health-wise, and maybe it's something really minor, maybe it's something really major, but there's always something that all of us are facing that we have to respect in our practice.
I think that's a good kind of topic to segue, because we have talked about challenges on the mat, the postures. I think I talked mostly about that, sorry. But what are some of those other challenges that you guys face off the mat, like these other mental and physical challenges that have nothing to do with yoga? And, you know, do you view them as positive or negative? How do you overcome them? And we can talk past, we can talk present challenges, but what are some of those things that like have impacted your life? And maybe if you once viewed them as negative, how can we now, living and trying to live this lifestyle where we look at things through a lens of how have I progressed? How have I had self-improvement? Because in one of our first episodes, that is what we talked about, is like, how can we improve ourselves through the lifestyle of, you know, being a yogi? So, I would love to hear some of your stories.
A big one for me, especially lately, I think, is, so everyone always views yoga as like, oh, you're so zen and you're so like peaceful and so all these different things. Lindsay's laughing at me.
Also laughing at myself because I'm not, so.
But I think a big thing for me is, and whether it's that people actually do perceive this or it's all in my head sort of thing, but it's like, oh, I feel myself like when I lose my temper, which like I've got a temper, and or if something frustrates me, or if like I just feel like anxiety or like people pleasing tendencies just like bubble up and I just get overwhelmed. It's like, this is dumb. I do yoga. Like, I'm supposed to have, like, this shit together. Like, like, why is this happening? And in my head, it's always, I see other people, like, oh, other people are looking at me, well, she's a yoga teacher, and, like, she's a mess, so. And it's finding that, like, balance, I think, of just figuring out that it's, like, yoga doesn't make those things go away.
No.
Yoga doesn't, like, fix your anger. Like, there are always going to be things that make me angry. Like, that's part of our human experience. but I feel like through yoga I now have the tools to combat those like negative feelings, or those like tapes that just play on repeat in my brain about like, oh, people think, oh, I should, oh, what about, and I'm able to like stop and take a step back, and I've learned to like focus in on that breath, or figure out what it is that I need to really just reset my brain so it's less focused on that external and more focused on like where I actually am and what I actually need.
Good answer.
Yeah.
I love that. Like, I have
yes.
the tools. Yeah. Yes. I have the tools. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and what's really cool is that makes you so much more, I mean, you mentioned the human experience, but so much more relatable to people. And those are your people, right? And I say your as in, you know, all of us, like teachers, students, whatever. Those are your people, the ones that aren't looking at you and expecting you to fail, or like waiting for you to fail because, you know, you're a yoga teacher, you're so zen and calm all the time, always have your shit together. And anyone who actually believes that, you know, it's not gonna work out very well, right?
Yeah, newsflash, we're not.
Yeah. And so those are your people, the ones that are in this human experience with us, who want to work on improving ourselves while still loving on ourselves and showing body positivity, and wanting to actually use all of those things. And then instead of saying like, oh, I'm a yoga teacher and a yogi in spite of these things, I am a yogi because of these things, because I take up every aspect of my life and use that to teach others, or to teach myself in my own practice of how I want to go through my journey, my life, whichever word you want to put in there.
And I think kind of backpacking off of that, I view yoga as a lifestyle, and that doesn't mean that if you don't, that you're less of a yogi. And when I started yoga teacher training, I did not view yoga as a lifestyle. It was very much so a physical practice for me. It was a workout. I went in, I sweat for an hour, I went home, I felt good. And that was it.
When we say sweat, we're like
sweat.
Buckets.
It's 99 degrees. But that was it. It was just a physical practice for me, and slowly learning about yoga philosophy and how yoga does transfer off of our mats into our lives. I very slowly, because again, stubborn Midwest mindset, I very slowly started opening myself up to these other ideas, to these other things, And last year, at the beginning of the year, I set the intention, which I've never done. I mean, everyone sets New Year's resolutions that we don't finish come February. But we have this, societal thing where we set these New Year's resolutions to improve ourselves. And one of the yoga instructors I follow on Instagram said, why is it that we only look once a year at how to improve ourselves? And I kind of had to sit back from that post and go, she's right. Why is it that we have to set a New Year's resolution? Why can we not be a constant work in progress? And so last year I set the intention for the entire year of progress, not perfection, which I struggled with because I have OCD and I'm a perfectionist down to like the very point of being a perfectionist. And so that was something that I had to let go of in my yoga practice. And as I started letting go of the perfection of making sure that every single alignment was perfect and that when I looked up, the yoga posture looked perfect and that, letting go of all of that, I slowly started to notice that I was letting go of that in my day-to-day life. I wasn't having all of my hangers face the same way in my closet. I wasn't color coordinating things, and so with that, some of the stress of my life started to fade away, and I started to really pick and choose what I stressed out over. And it wasn't always the little things that stressed me out anymore. And I attribute that to yoga, because I really set that intention. And then 2018 rolled around and I kind of sat back on the year and I looked back and I was very happy with where my progress was at. And I mean, I spent 23 years being a perfectionist. 1 year is not going to change that. But, it's the fact that there was that progress. And I think sometimes we look at progress as it has to be these big, huge leaps of progress and it has to be these huge gestures. And sometimes that's not what progress is. It's very small. Maybe you don't even, like I said in another episode, maybe you even don't even notice a change in your posture. You just notice a change in the feeling of the posture, and that's still progress. And I think another thing that I've taken from yoga on the mat to off the mat is we are a very go, go, go society. And we want the newest thing, we want the grandest thing, and we want it right now. I wanted it 2 seconds ago. And with yoga, you don't get that with the postures. You don't get that stress relief. You don't get the postures in 2 seconds. You don't get it right away. And we struggle with that. And that's something I've taken off the mat is when I'm struggling with something, there's a reason why, and I need to slow down and really tune into, okay, why am I having a panic attack this week? It's not just because I randomly got triggered by something or it just randomly popped up in my life. There's a reason. So I need to tune into why is it actually happening? What is actually going on? And it forces you to slow down and to take yourself out of that go, 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 go routine that we kind of just drive our lives in. And we start to take over, the wheel on our lives a little bit more.
All of you guys keep talking about this concept that we're going to put a name to it. And there's a concept in yoga called self-study. Anybody want to give the real word?
Svadhyaya.
Good job. Okay.
Is that's been the one you've been...
Yeah, that's actually my 2018 intention
Gina's
for the
hashtag.
Year. Yeah, my hashtag year of self-study, year of Svadhyaya, which one is really fun to say, Svadhyaya. I mean, it's really just really fun to say, but it is self-study, and it goes beyond kind of the cultural, I want to say, popular aspect of self-care right now that's really popular. It goes into what makes you tick, why do you tick that way, how do you respond to things, and it goes on so many deeper levels. And that is a part of yoga philosophy. It is part of one of the limbs of yoga. And I wanted to spend this year because in the last few years, I've went through this crazy lifestyle change. I got married. I had a baby unexpectedly. Not that she was unexpected, but the actual delivery of her was very unexpected. We both almost died. There was a lot of crazy things that happened in my life in the last 2 years. And I've kind of been on this like whirlwind cyclone, and yoga has always grounded me back to who I am. And in a sense, who I am has changed because of yoga. And I don't think that I have turned into a different person. I think I'm just more authentically who I was all along.
Mm-hmm. Side note, will you organize my closet, please?
Yes.
It's okay to be perfectionist when it comes to other people.
Yeah.
You should just charge for that. There are some things on my off the mat life, I guess you could say, that have been challenges for me. And my big one, before coming to yoga and during my kind of transition to really trying to live a lifestyle of self-study, which is essentially what yoga is that I have struggled, just like Gina was talking about with body image, but I think it went a little bit beyond just how I've looked at my body. But I've had a really dramatic weight loss and also just body change in general. And the timing of that weight loss was just a little bit before a huge life change, which was the passing of my mother about 3 years ago. And so I was pretty young, you know, for how young people are when they usually lose a parent. But I went from, you know, losing weight really in a healthy way to losing weight in an unhealthy way. And not because I wanted to or because I was so obsessed with this idea, but because we're going to talk about yoga for healing in another episode, and I'll kind of share a little bit more about it. But I was really guilty about my mom's death and just, you know, like how it happened. And I stopped eating because now I can look back at it as this self-study and say I was punishing myself. And I didn't realize that was why. People didn't notice it. It was what we'd call probably an unidentified eating disorder or unclassified. It wasn't bulimia or anorexia necessarily, but it was under the guise of like, I'm like transitioning to this healthy lifestyle. I'm trying to be healthy, but deep down, I knew at the time that I couldn't bring myself to eat, that I felt like I didn't deserve that. And so that was right before I actually started YTT, is that I was coming just a few months off of this pretty like bad eating disorder of not wanting to fuel my body. And then during YTT, our first weekend was over cleanses
and detoxing.
And I big time struggled with that because, and in fact, I thought, I don't think I can do this because if I start, it's going to trigger this again. Because now that I am coming out of this, after a couple of years of being out of kind of having an eating disorder, I realized that you always have it. It's something you're all like, just like people who are alcoholics will always be alcoholics or have an addiction, like, and that's something that they talk about. You know, friends of mine who've talked about that have said like that's just something that you call yourself, even though you don't consume it anymore. It's kind of like now it's a weird thing to, you know, have as a classifier for yourself. However, it does help me to understand what I should do for my own self and for my own body. And so, for example, even though detoxing and even though particular aspects of a diet are often included in a lot of people who practice yoga or yoga teachers, that's part of who they are, I pretty much knew for myself, because I was ready to be in the mindset of self-study. I knew for myself and I knew for my body that I didn't think I could do that I didn't think I could do a cleanse. I didn't think I could do a detox. I didn't even think that I could do an elimination diet at that time in my life, because I thought I am going to fall back down into this. And so I didn't. And that was part of our yoga teacher training. And I just decided to incorporate like more vegetables and raw vegetables and things instead of taking something out. And so that was helpful. That was kind of my approach to it. So this concept of like, you know, challenges off the mat, that's a big one for me, is that I struggle with how I view myself, how I view my weight and my body. And I wish that I did not have that. You know, it is not something that I enjoy.
Preach, girl, preach.
Yeah, seriously. And so I think that's my biggest challenge off the mat. And so I might talk about it a lot. And, you know, like I mentioned, we're going to have this episode of Yoga for Healing when we start talking about what is self-care and all of this. And that's a big one. You know, how do you heal your body with yoga? So
how do you heal your body? I think it was Tina Fey, which shout out to Tina Fey. I love that woman.
Mm-hmm. But you can also be on our podcast.
Yeah, Tina Fey can also come on the podcast.
Yeah, Tina, girl,
but there's a quote out there where she talks about women are expected to have Spanish lips, Brazilian ass, tight thighs, tiny ankles, wear high heels, be sexy but not too sexy, be voluptuous but not too voluptuous. We're supposed to be sexy and conservative, and there's all these labels. We're supposed to have this, we're supposed to have that, we're supposed to be this. And, you know, we're starting to, not even just yogis, but we're starting to as a society to break away from that a little bit and respecting where people are and who they are and not placing those labels. And it's been really big, I would say, in the last 5 years of accepting the fact that, you know, this is how I am. I am pale. Y'all know this. If you ever see a photo of me, I am ghost pale. And I struggled with that. And it sounds so stupid, but I struggled with that in middle school and high school because the it thing was to be tan. Yeah. And you can ask my husband, who knew me at the time, what happens when I do self-tanner. Hi-yo oompa loompa. I mean, it was just the most embarrassing thing. And I thought, how stupid is this that I've gone through this whole thing. I look ridiculous now just for this very vain kind of vanity type thing. And I think a lot of the time self-care gets thrown in with the same topic of vanity. And I hate that. I really do, because there's so much more and it's so deeper. It's so much deeper than that. And I think that we're just finally scraping the top of letting the labels roll off our shoulders and not having the world whisper, you need to be this weight, you need to be this tall, you need to look like this, and letting that roll off the shoulders and go, no, this is who I am, this is what I want, this is what is good for me. And I think yoga really helps with that, because we are learning our bodies and we are respecting our bodies and we're respecting our journey. And it helps with that. At least for me, I feel like that's really helped, and that's tuned in to that whole thing about letting go of others' expectations of what you should be and saying, that's great that you think that, or that's great that that's what you want from me, or that's how you view me, but this is who I am, and this is how I'm going to be, and this is what I expect of myself.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is yoga.
That's yoga.
That's the definition of it, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and I was going to say something that was coming up for me when both Gina and Lindsay were talking, was that talking about, like, that self-study, or talking about, like, where, like, things that used to happen to you, or, like, feelings that you have, or just, like, those type of viewpoints, or the self-study aspect, I guess, like, learning, like, what makes you tick, learning, like, how your brain processes things, learning how your body, like, just processes things in general. And also, I think a good thing to tag on to that is an understanding that without judgment of yourself.
Yes.
Because it's so easy to be like, oh, I'm a perfectionist and that's what's a terrible thing about me. It's like it can be an aspect of you without it being a terrible, a terrible...
Without having a negative attachment
exactly.
to it.
So I think a big portion of that self-study is learning to identify those things and learning to be able to be like, this is what makes me tick. This is what makes me, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's okay.
I'm okay with that. And if it is like something that could be viewed as, quote, like, negative, like about your past or about, like, something else, it's part of what brought me here. It's part of what makes me who I am today, and that's okay. And being okay with that, I guess, is a good, like, add-on, I guess, to that self-study.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and as we discussed at the beginning of the episode, we want to try, as people who are practitioners of yoga, to try to view those things that we view as negative originally as something that we can turn into a positive and turn into something that is a self-study, and say, how does this make me the person that I am, and how does that make me a better person, despite whether the thing itself is negative? How has it improved you?
Yeah. There is a book I'm currently reading that I just happened to pick up at a local bookstore called Lost Connections, and it's making the connections about how we became a depressed society, and a society where 60 to 80% of people rely on antidepressants. And I just read the title of the book and, like, the kind of just subtitle underneath, and I thought, okay, let's read this. I know I used to suffer with depression very, very heavily in high school and to college, and it's something I have a really great hold on now, but kind of like Lindsay said, it's something that you just carry with you. And so I, at this point in time, wouldn't call myself depressed, but I've been in a very dark place before of depression. And I thought, what the hell? I want to read this book. I want to see what this guy has to say about it. And one of the first things he says is that depression is a lifestyle. And I was kind of angry that he said that, because I was like, excuse me? Who are you? What? And he basically goes into kind of what we're talking here about, from what I'm getting from all of us, is that it's a mindset. Everything we do is a mindset. So you have these negative, quote unquote, negative things in your life, but being a perfectionist doesn't have to be a negative thing. It can be a positive thing. And he talks about how we, as just people in general, the top of the top tier scientists, still don't quite understand what our brain is. it's a brain, it's up there, it does stuff. But I mean, really, they don't quite know how our brain functions and it works. They know the basic functions. They know, what it kind of does, but they don't know everything.
And what it's capable
of. And they were talking about how in a lot of these studies of these antidepressants, not the placebo group or not the group that was given the drug, but actually the third group that we don't hear about a lot is the other control group where they give them nothing. And they see how long it takes compared to the placebo and compared to the drug for them to get quote unquote better. And they call that kind of your mindset. And he talks a lot about how our mindset really affects how we live our lives, how we view our lives, and how we view others' lives around us. And I was very angry with this thought because I've taken antidepressants. And I thought, who are you to say this to me? Who are you to say that everything we've known over the past 30 years is wrong? Like, who are you? Listen. And I started to kind of understand. I might not agree with everything in the book, but I kind of started to understand, and I did relate it a lot to yoga, about how we do talk a lot about the mindset of yoga, to not compare ourselves, to not judge ourselves, to learn ourselves, that self-study or svadhyaya, and it started to make more sense to me. And I think that's something that we've kind of all discussed during this podcast, is it's mindset. It's how you decide to look at things, because you have a choice when you look at something, and it's how you decide on that choice.
So, however, we are not medical
professionals. No, and we are not medical professionals in any way, shape, or form. Disclaimer there that it was just something that I took from the book. And like I said, in high school, I took antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds because I so desperately needed them. And I would not be the person I am sitting here today without those. But I did think that this particular author's take on it was very interesting. But yes, we are not medical professionals. Please do not stop taking those if you are prescribed.
Yep, currently on anxiety medication, and it is very helpful to me, and it's something that yoga hasn't been able to fix,
and that's where you are. I think that's, if nothing else, all of these challenges that we've talked about, they might be really challenging for one person, they're nothing to someone else. Someone might be just really sad, or someone is like clinically depressed.
Yeah, actually,
there's no way to compare them to anyone else's experience, anyone else's journey, because we all have our own shit that we go through every day.
Yeah, we all have, there's that old saying of, you can't say anything about my life because you haven't walked a mile in my shoes, but we all have our different life experiences that lead us to the person that we are, and none of those life experiences should be discounted or discredited just because the person sitting next to you hasn't had them.
Absolutely. Well, that being said, we would love to hear some of the challenges that you are facing, whether that is on your mat, whether that's off your mat, and how can you use this concept of self-study that we want to have when we live a yogic lifestyle. How can you use that to help look at this in a positive way?
Well, we would love to hear from you guys. So give us an email at hello@flyoveryogispodcast.com. And you can also find us on Facebook and Instagram at Fly Over Yogis. And we would love for you to leave us a review on iTunes. Thank you so much for listening.
Namaste.
Namaste. I forgot.
The light within me sees and loves the light within you, even though I forgot.